and gentlemen, I'm sure that you guys, like me, spend most of your leisure time wondering just how do we adapt mid-core gameplay to more casual platforms. Luckily for us, this morning, Mike Goslin, the general manager of Rebel Entertainment, is here to show us the way. Mike.
Right, thanks, Scott. So I guess I don't need to introduce the title of my talk. I'm talking about adapting mid-core gameplay to casual systems, casual platforms. My background, actually, I started out in my career doing the opposite. I was kind of bringing casual players to hardcore platforms. I did some MMORPGs for Disney, Toontown Online, and Pirates of the Caribbean Online, where we were sort of doing the opposite thing. For those of you who don't know what an MMORPG is, it's many men role-playing as girls online. Just thought I would clarify that. More recently, I've been working on doing what, the title of the talk, taking sort of core and mid-core, whatever you want to call it, gameplay and bringing it to casual platforms. I did a game called Dungeon Rampage for Facebook, which is a good example of this. It got quite large, and it was definitely a crossover, and was one of the early examples of this on the Facebook platform. And now we're working on a game called Storm the Gates, which is kind of actually more in the core range. I would say it's kind of a hardcore game with the core target being on the iPad. So I've learned a lot of sort of lessons going both directions, and I think there's some sort of high-level observations that will be really helpful to those of you who are thinking about this space. And I think the question you have to ask yourself is, why are you doing this? Why would you want to try and bring this kind of gameplay to these platforms? And the obvious answer is, well, you want hardcore gamers because they have a lot of money and they have a lot of time and they spend a lot of money playing games, and so they have high LTVs. And so that's the obvious answer, but I actually think the opportunity is much bigger than this. Because if you think about what a gamer is and what core gamer means, it's really a behavioral thing. I mean, it's not an intrinsic trait. There's not something that makes these people different from each other. It's really the behavior. So if you look at a graph of people playing games, you're looking at how many hours they're playing. You're not really looking at who they are and demographics. And if you're blind to that, you actually recognize the opportunities. If the opportunity is behavior, you can change behavior. I mean, B.F. Skinner has shown us that you can teach people to behave the way that you want them to. And in this case, it's playing the games a lot and sticking around and hopefully spending money. And we saw this happen firsthand. This is why I brought up Toontown. It's a good example of this. We made the game for kids, but it's a hardcore MMORPG, so there's a lot of leveling, a lot of depth. And what would happen is the moms would start playing because they wanted to see what the kids were doing. They had no experience with this kind of game. Most of them had never played a game before. And they sort of started to get into the game, and they started playing more and more. And eventually, we had a period where there were about 30% of our players who identified themselves as the primary player were moms, 30-plus-year-old female players who were playing 40-plus hours a week, and they were driving the revenues for the product in a big way. And so this is sort of the potential here. I think you can kind of bring people on board if you do the right things in your game design. So that's the opportunity I'm kind of going to talk about here in more detail. Before I get into it, though, how many of you are working on games that are aimed at a casual audience right now? Okay. How many people are trying to target more core or mid-core players? All right, so it's about equal split. Okay. I think this is relevant to both you guys, so I'll sort of I'll try and go through the material kind of quickly, and then if I get at the end and you guys want to dive in more deeply, that would be a good time to kind of jump in a little more. But when you're talking about this kind of gameplay, and I'm going to sort of use mid-core and core interchangeably, I'm really talking about things that take advantage of the behavioral differences. And I've kind of grouped it into 3 categories. I think there's a lot of categories here, but just to keep it simple, I'm going to focus on time, challenge, and community as sort of the buckets of features. So jumping into time first, if you look at the behavior of gamers, they spend a lot more time than a casual gamer would playing, but they also play a lot faster. They're smarter about how they play. They get through your content faster. So it's sort of a double whammy. You're getting hit twice because not only they play more, but they play kind of more efficiently, and so they chew through content. So your biggest problem is staying ahead of that. And if you're going to try and keep them around for a long time, on a casual platform type budget, you're going to have to be smart about it. And so the obvious thing, and the thing that most of us end up doing at some point, is the RPG treadmill approach. So build your system so that, I mean, really what it boils down to is levels. Have levels and make the levels hard, increasingly difficult to achieve. And that gives you a framework where you can sort of stretch your content out over a long period of time. The problem with this is it can get boring. If you don't have enough variety, if you don't mix it up, if there's no surprise, people figure out that they're on a treadmill, and so you have to do something else. If you have a single-player game, though, there aren't a lot of options. So I think this is probably the best one to start with. But if you have multiplayer, then you can start getting into more interesting turf. I think user-generated content is a really good way to do this, and it never gets boring. You just have to give players the tools. And the nice thing about this, too, and I'm going to talk about this over and over again, is there's this sort of dual nature. If you're trying to bring in mid-core or core players in your game, but you also want to keep your casual players, it's great to think about both levels of your game design at the same time. So for example, in Minecraft, you have these kind of core users that build amazing environments like this out of the tools that are provided. And then the casual players have something to walk around and sort of be looky-loos in. And so it sort of works for both. And because it's multiplayer, there's a big incentive for these guys. You don't have to specifically reward them for building these things. They get the praise from the community. They get noticed. They end up higher in the ratings for their creations. And so it works out great. And you can even take this further by combining it with an RPG treadmill, where you unlock some of the creative capabilities by playing more, and you're getting a huge multiplier effect on all the content that you produce. But I think if you have multiplayer, actually the best way to do it, and I'm completely won over by this, is PvP, player versus player competition, because this, not only is it sort of endless, it also gets to some of the other categories. So it also affects the challenge and the community. And so I'll kind of be talking about PvP a lot. If you think about it in terms of efficiency, though, League of Legends, I mean, they only had to build one level, and it's not that big, really, and they get to use it over and over again because it's different every time. Sure, they have a lot of heroes, but it's really about the other people that you're playing against. I can play the same person using a particular hero, and it'll be different from another person playing it. And so that's where all the content is really coming from. And so this is the kind of thing, and I'm going to talk about these high level, and I'm happy to dive into more detail, but I'm sort of trying to give inspiration about where you should go with on your casual platform game. So since this is in the operations track, you have to think about the operational implications of some of these decisions, though. So if you're doing an RPG treadmill, for example, now you got to think about your storing state. People are making progress. You got to store state on a database somewhere. So now you have all this sort of back-end stuff that you didn't necessarily have to worry about before. So persistence, implies servers. Scalability, your bottleneck often when you have these games is often on your data, because there's one database. It's hard to replicate that easily if everybody's playing in the same world. Multiplayer only makes it more difficult. All these things have security implications, moderation implications. So your sort of live team gets a lot bigger, and that's the price you pay. But I think it's worth it because you keep people for much longer. And part of this is really thinking about your game as a service ultimately at the end of the day. And that's smart, because retention really translates into that lifetime value. The other reason you have to take this stuff seriously is because if you've got a mixed audience of casual players in there as well, you've got to make sure that you take care of the sort of the moderation issues, like in the user-generated content. You got to make sure there's not giant penises being built out of Minecraft blocks. The casual players aren't going to be very tolerant of that. And also you got to worry about the toxic sort of PvP culture that can come up. And if you don't actively work on that, it will happen, because the competition kind of breeds, sort of bad behavior. And if you're not actively rewarding it, it's going to go the other way. League of Legends, for example, has done a good job of sort of rewarding good behavior. They've started to clean up their community a little bit, and it's probably allowing them to go broader with their audience. So let's jump into challenge now. Challenge is where things really start to split between casual and kind of more core gamers. The core gamer wants things to be difficult right away. They want to know, and in fact, if it's too easy, they may not even try your game. So it's got to be hard right up front. And the casual player tends to be the opposite. If you hit them up with something really hard right away, they're like, oh, this isn't for me, they're going to go away. And so you need to think about this really hard. And this is more of a sort of philosophy. There's no real answer to this. You just have to think about both sides and how can you make it easy for one and challenging for the other at the same time. I've kind of sort of tried to instill in my teams the idea of just keeping the mantra of make it easy to learn and difficult to master. Because if you're thinking about that on every decision that you're making about your design, you will probably end up doing the right thing. And it works in both ways. It works for the people that are never going to be core players, they're just casual players. It also works for the people that are going to kind of they're going to migrate up the stack. They're going to become increasingly more core in their behavior. You don't want to just send them away too early because every person is potentially a core, high-value player for you. So when you go back to PvP again, it's not enough to have PvP. If you think about this challenge, and in fact the increasing challenge that you really need to pay very close attention to your matchmaking. There are a lot of good ways to do this, but you have to be scientific and precise because you want the win percentage to be consistent every time they play, and they're going to get better over time. And so you have to really spend a lot of energy on your matchmaking. And that also implies a lot of stuff operationally. I'll talk about it in a second, but there are some really good approaches right now, and the standard ones. I mean, we use the ELO for our Storm the Gates game, and it does a good job of every time you play, you think you can win, but it's not a guaranteed, and so you have that nice growth of challenge every time you go out. And part of this is also the leaderboards. Your leaderboards have to be really good and up to date and real time, and they have to reflect this ranking, and so people can understand why they're being matched with who they're being matched and what they've accomplished. The nice thing about this is also a great retention tool because a core player really is going to keep playing because they want to improve their ranking and they want to show up on the board. The thing to keep in mind though is you don't want to just have global leaderboards. You also want to have leaderboards among friends because a casual player doesn't really care necessarily where they stand with respect to the whole world and might be totally put off by finding out they're not in the top million or 10 million even in some of these games. So keep in mind who your audience is and have flexibility in your leaderboard system. But leaderboards, if done right, are incredibly powerful. I don't know how many of you guys played way too much Bejeweled Blitz. I got totally hooked on it, and you wouldn't think that this is sort of a thing that would appeal to sort of more core gamers, but just seeing your friend pass you on that list just you got to play. And I know a lot of people that kind of got into this, and it's a good example. That's pretty much the main kind of mid-core feature that they had. The rest of the game is incredibly casual and sort of single player, but just adding those leaderboards made it extremely powerful, and I think it's a great example of using these things well. So again, on the operational implications of these things, real-time stats, that implies a lot of your backend has to be able to deal with all the data in kind of real time and put it back forward, because if you think about it now, your matchmaking, your ranking is sort of a communication with your players. It's part of the community loop, and so you want it to be up to date, and you want to make sure that it's right, because people get really upset if it's not working the way they're expecting. And so I think it's worth the investment, but again, it's there's sort of an ongoing live implication of this. So now finally talking about community. I mean, community is really the best way to keep people sticking around for a long time. I mean, the reason that user-generated content works is because people get to create, but then they also get the respect of other people in the community. They have something to talk about. It's really the icebreaker to form relationships with other people. And so this is true of both core and casual gamers. And if you can kind of have a community that's one community that serves both populations, that's awesome. I almost never see that. In reality, what you have to do is think about it as multiple sort of communities or different levels of community. And it's hard to control without structure. So I almost always, whenever you've got any kind of intent to bring in gamers, you've got to think about them in terms of guilds, really organized communities, and organized in a way that the people who want to be elite can be elite or be elder or whatever you want to call it. This structure gives them a way to avoid the casual players if they want to. It gives you a way to incentivize them to be nice to the new players and even to mentor them. If you set up your guild reward structure in such a way that they're rewarded for bringing in new players and converting them for you, now they're doing the heavy lifting for you of moving players up that stack, and it's a great framework for doing that. The other thing that Elder gameplay or in-games do for you is it really gives you sort of two games in a sense, if you do it right, because your core players are going to play really fast through the beginning part of your game and get into the end game right away. So to them, the whole beginning game is just sort of like a tutorial or something to get through to get into the real game. For them, the real game is the end game, and they can go wail on each other and not cause problems for your new players that are still learning or deciding whether they want to spend time in this game. And whereas the casual players now, they have a place they can come in and work their way up and maybe eventually get into the end game, or maybe never. Maybe their whole experience is just in the beginning part, and that's okay too. you probably won't. They probably won't monetize as well, but you still will be putting yourself in a position to win over those candidates for becoming your more core players. So again, the big operational impact of this is moderation and community management. You really have to have a team that's doing this, especially have multiple communities. You have to speak to them differently. They have different needs. It's a lot of stuff to sort of deal with, but it's worth it because, again, it's part of the service. It's part of what is the glue that keeps people in your product. So let's just say you're able to build all these systems and so on your casual platform game to sort of keep these players happy. How do you actually track them, though? And this is something that I'm struggling with a little bit because Apple doesn't do a great job of targeting, helping you target. You can do some kinds of targeting, but it's really difficult to sort of advertise to an audience. It's a sort of a niche audience, even still. And if your game looks wrong, this is where theme actually comes into play. If your game looks like this, a core, mid-core gamer's not going to try it. So you have to do a little bit. You can't really serve everybody without thinking about it a little bit. So this is kind of an extreme example, but it will help your acquisition if you send the message to them at the very outset, even though they will chew through really fast and find out. You've got to send the door has to be painted in such a way that they recognize that there's something there for them. So what I'm kind of left with, at least for now, is that your probably best means of acquiring these players is through word of mouth. So try and facilitate that. If you have social features available, you can use that. Don't be gimmicky. Let them tell their friends. The leaderboards and so on are kind of a natural way of re-engaging players, but you need to give them also tools to have their friends come in and join their guild and so on. So if you do all these things, I think you can have the best of both worlds. You can have an audience that's mixed, and hopefully, and the big goal is to convert those players that weren't core or mid-core in their behavior, but become that way, because those are the most valuable. They'll sort of stick around the longest. They'll be sort of passionate about your product, and most importantly, they'll tell other like-minded people to come in, and so you sort of create this virtuous cycle, and your game kind of can grow organically in the right way. So that's my talk. Anybody have any questions?
What pitfalls do you? Thank you. What pitfalls do you see with current mid-core games, and why we see so few of them consistently breaking into the top 100 grossing, especially on like iPhone and iPad?
Well, that's a problem of reach. So there's no really good way to find that audience right now. So they grow really slowly, and some of them don't have enough time to grow organically into the top ranking spot. If you think about it, it's like top 40 radio. You don't see a lot of alt music making it into top 40 radio for the same reason. It's a niche product right now. But I think ideally what you want to do is have categories for that, or at least search categories within the App Store. That'll help a lot, or more targeted ways of marketing to them. But marketing's not the best way to reach them. It's kind of an open problem, and that's something that I spend a lot of time trying to figure out. But eventually what you will see them start to break in, because they do have higher lifetime values. And so over time, you're going to see that category emerge. But I think right now it's a sort of reflection of the way the marketplace is structured, not that there's not much potential there. I also think the games, the mid-core games and stuff that are out there aren't retaining people as long as they ultimately will. They're still learning some of these things. A lot of these developers didn't come from doing core games, so they don't know how to build these deep structures, or they don't have time within their budgets to do it. I mean, it's a lot of work to do. So I think when it's sort of a chicken and the egg problem. You'll see a cycle as they'll start to emerge, and then people know, hey, it's worth investing more, because it costs more to build them and to operate them. So
over here, thanks for the presentation. One of the things we're struggling with on the PvP side is tablet controls versus the mouse and the keyboard. Any sort of stuff that you guys experienced that you'd share, or things like that, trying to match that up, especially if you're doing cross-platform.
Yeah. So cross-platform, touch games cross-platform are really tough, because you sort of really want it to feel native and be a touch game. I haven't seen a lot of examples of people doing cross-platform really well where it feels the same on both platforms, or it's even equivalent. Like if I'm in a shooter and one of us is on a tablet and one's on a PC, usually one side has a huge advantage. I don't know how to deal with it on shooters. Like Twitch games are going to be the hardest. I think for other kinds of games, I've been focusing on strategy games, partially because of that. I think strategy games, it's okay, and in fact, it's kind of nice if you let them choose what platform they want to play with, and sort of get out of the way of the player.
Are you thinking RTS?
Yeah, RTS, or ours is a turn-based strategy game, but it's kind of the same thing. So there's not a huge advantage. It's sort of more a preference thing. And in fact, in our game, we kind of are hoping that sometimes people will be playing on the couch, on their tablet, and sometimes they may want to sit, on their PC either at work, or they just want to, be a lean forward kind of mode. Maybe have a bigger screen with more resolution or something. But I don't think it's been solved. It's an open problem, which is great. It's why I think it's exciting right now.
To what extent do you think that open ratings and rankings compel players to excel versus the rate at which it repels or drives people away from the game because they feel like they're the low man on the totem pole?
I think it can drive players away if they feel like they're low man on the totem pole, of course. But what players do, and you can kind of take advantage of their natural behavior, they tend to ignore things that they don't like. So if you have somebody who doesn't want to see where they stack up against everybody, they'll leave it always in the mode of looking at them compared to their friends, or they won't look at it at all. So it's not really, I don't think it's a huge problem unless you shove it in their face all the time. So you want to make it kind of something that's there. So the people that care about it, they're going to scrutinize it. And it's going to be one of their motivators. They're going to try and climb those rankings. But I think having the friend mode is the one that most people care about. There are very few people that can be at the top of these big pyramids. So I would say in general, just don't make them deal with it every time they play, and you're probably okay. People will look at it the amount that they're interested in. That's been my experience. Any other questions? Okay, thanks everybody.